Yeah. So the topic that we're going to discuss today is the difficulties children with learning disability experience during the COVID-19 by these three amazing speakers. And now I will handle this. I will let the speakers to handle these panels. So, Ms. Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us. This interdisciplinary conference seems really interesting. I think too often we sit in our separate silos, and this is a chance to exchange views with a broader array of disciplines. In any case, for those of you with sharp eyes, you may see that the title of our presentation is a little bit different than in the program. We decided we're calling our presentation Issues During COVID-19 with Children Perspectives on Education. We absolutely are talking about the impact of children with disabilities, but children with disabilities are a subset of children. And I think to understand the impact that COVID has had, continues to have on children with disabilities, I think it's important to understand the impact of children in general. Three of us are going to be presenting. I'm going to start. Michelle will talk about children with disabilities. Julie will talk next, and I will finish it off. And I'm a psychologist, a professor at UMBC in the psych department, and I head up the doctoral program in applied developmental psychology, and I focus on issues of education for children with normative development mainly, and atypical development, and mainly with younger kids. And I think Michelle and Julie will introduce themselves. Next slide, please. Whoever's managing this. Okay, the four presentations started by me is the impact of COVID-19 on children considered typically developing. Next presentation will be Michelle, the impact of COVID-19 on children with disabilities. Julie will talk with examples from teachers. And then I will talk about educational policy and considerations. Next, please. Before we can talk about the impact of COVID, I think we need to step back a bit and think about what's the purpose of schooling in the United States? What's the purpose of formal schooling in the United States? And I think, quite frankly, it's not only in the US, although that's what I will be talking about, but it's in most industrialized societies. Children grow up at home and they go to school. Why do we do that in industrialized societies? Probably because we think that the home can't handle all of the requisites that these children will need to be proper citizens when they get older. Parents have other commitments. Parents work outside the home. What is it that we expect schools to do? Because schools represent the belief system of the people populating the society. We expect the schools to teach what used to be called the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. We expect, in other words, the schools to teach the basic processes here. Some people now say we should also include the big C, coding. Children are supposed to use that knowledge that they gain in terms of these skills to learn content. So in the US, I would imagine most children in high school are exposed to the playwright Shakespeare and read a play or two of his, to give one example here. Not only, however, do we focus on the two things I just discussed, school typically takes place in a social arena. Children go to school, they're in classes with 10, 20, 30 other children. This is the place for them to learn how to get on with others, skills that will be very pertinent as they join the working world later on, as they join the adult world. And as an aside, we know that some kids are homeschooled, but one of the weaknesses of homeschooling was a lack of social interaction, and many homeschool programs have now had to add that. Unfortunately, in our society, not all children from different demographic groups achieve the same success. There's often a mismatch between what the kids are getting at home and what they're getting at school. And I think it's the goal of our school system to decrease the gaps between demographic groups. The reason I bring this up, as we'll talk about, COVID has although COVID affected all people in our society, it's differentially affected people from different groups. Children from minoritized groups, Black children and brown children, so to speak, children from low-income backgrounds, and children with disabilities have been disproportionately affected by COVID. Next slide, please. Thank you. In spring 2020, most schools in the US fairly abruptly segued from bricks and mortar classrooms to virtual means of education. Michelle and I teach full-time at UMBC. Julie's an adjunct. We all got this abrupt notice. In middle of March, we got an email saying, next week is spring break, 2 days before spring break. We're not going to be returning after spring break. That was it. The students got the same notice, but they were told to pack up their dorm rooms as well. Over 55 million children in the US experienced some form of school closure. 93% of them transitioned to virtual schooling. How exactly this was done varied across schools. What seemed to be fairly common across schools, however, were the negative things. So teachers had little advanced instruction. I told you what we had at UMBC, and we actually were considered to have done a good job. Schools were just sort of told, don't come in. School teachers didn't necessarily know how to handle virtual instruction. They'd never done this before. And many of them didn't have adequate internet access, adequate computers. And if you think about it, school teachers can also be parents. Many of them had their children at home now, and they had to figure out what to do with their kids. And especially at the preschool level, Michelle and I have done several studies on this. A lot of the teachers talked about being scared that they were going to lose their jobs, that the preschool site would close and they wouldn't have a job. As well, they worried about getting COVID themselves or their family members getting COVID. So this made it hard for them to focus on teaching the children under charge. In terms of the parents, probably in the late 1900s, early 20s, the school systems in the US expect parents to have some form of involvement. What does that mean? They expect the parents to get their kids to school on time. They expect their kids to come in having been fed, ready to learn. Some teachers expect the parents to do more, check homework, perhaps assist a bit, make sure the child has the supplies, etc., etc. Again, this totally changed with COVID. Now the expectation was that parents were supposed to be the paraeducator, be the assistant teacher, be the co-teacher. Parents, especially for the younger kids, were expected to basically be sitting at the computer with their child. And not all parents had the time, inclination, or capability to do that. In fact, one parent in a study we did basically said that she has 3 kids. She's working at home full time now. Her husband is working at home. They can't handle this. They had money. They were fortunate enough to have hired a tutor for their children. So they brought someone in to teach their children. And I've mentioned they don't all have internet access, computers, etc. The middle income parents do, but the low income parents don't necessarily. Next slide, please. So what do we find is happening here in terms of how well children are learning? And again, this is data that Michelle and I and others and Julie have collected. Teachers are reporting, and again, if you think about it, some of this is played out in the newspapers where educators are very concerned about what will the impact on children be. Initially, it was, when are we going to get them back into school because they're losing out? Now we're reporting, yep, they lost out. So what do the teachers say here? Teachers, based on their experiences, said the children were learning less virtually than they had in regular classrooms, in part because the kids aren't paying attention, parents aren't helping them all that well, kids are frequently off topic. Parents say the same thing, except they blame the teachers because they say the teachers aren't doing a good job teaching the kids. And interestingly, the parents are also saying kids preferred in-school instruction to virtual instruction. What else are we finding? There was an interesting study by Kufeld et al. That came out a few months ago that looked at something like 5 million children in the United States, a big sample. And they compared the COVID children in terms of their reading and their math scores in the fall of 2021 with an earlier cohort in, I think it was the fall of 2019, pre-COVID, to see how well they'd done. And they found that the COVID children scored significantly lower than the pre-pandemic children. And it was a large difference, larger than any other natural disaster had caused. Let's turn now to what is abbreviated as NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Many of you may know this as the nation's report card. You read about this in the newspapers every other year. They test 4th, 8th, and 12th graders typically every other year. This fall, NAEP reported what everybody informally had already said, that the children weren't doing well. They focused on 4th graders and found that their reading and math scores had dropped and were significantly lower, I think, than they'd been in years since this started. Interestingly, they also interviewed children, interviewed subset of these 4th graders about what they had experienced during COVID. 57% of the students, the 4th graders, recalled experiencing remote learning last fall. The question was, what supports did the kids have? They compared kids at the bottom 25th percentile, the low scorers, to kids at the 75th and above percentile, the higher scorers. They asked them, did you have a desktop computer, a laptop, some tablet? The high scorers, 82% of them said yes. The low scorers, 49% of them said yes. This is a significant difference. Did you have a quiet place to work at least some of the time? 70% of the low scorers said yes. 91% of the high scorers said yes. Let me give you an example of this. During this time period, I was evaluating a literacy intervention program in Baltimore City. And at first I did this in-house, in the fall of 2019. COVID hit, and then I had to use the internet. internet didn't work well with the school system. Any case, initially I was observing in first grade, and I observed the class, and there was one boy in the class who was outstanding. Unlike many of the other kids, he paid attention, he sat quietly, he was well behaved, and he seemed to know the answer to all the questions. When I next observed him at home in and online in fall of 2020, I believe it was, he was in a room with an older brother and his grandmother. His older brother was not a scholar and spent much time trying to play with his brother. The grandmother, I think, was sick and kept asking this child to get her tissues, to get her water, etc. The boy no longer paid any attention to the lesson, could not answer any questions correctly. This is just an example of the difference that took place. Another child I observed handled her online instruction by lying on her bed under her blanket and periodically calling out answers. Okay. Another question Nate had the kids answer is, was their teacher available to help with schoolwork at least once or twice a week? 37% of the low-scoring kids said yes. 50% of the low-scoring kids said no. In other words, in terms of the number, there seems to be a real difference in what was available to different groups of children in instruction, sort of explaining why we keep finding differences in performance across demographic groups. Summing up then, why were there differences in how kids are performing? One is access to technology. Certain groups of kids, the low-income, minoritized children, have less access. And I should mention, with technology, even when families, well, I'll return to that in a second. The kids were not attending that well, and they weren't paying good attention here. Me, just one second here. Let me just mention one more thing then about technology before turning it over to Michelle. Many school systems were aware that not everybody had computers at home, and they tried to make these available to all children. The problem was, it was hard. It isn't like they dropped it off at somebody's house, but frequently the parents had to fill out forms. It was complicated. Even when you had computers, you needed access to the internet. I have, I think, good access to the internet. And when I had to observe classrooms in this urban school district I was working with, it was horrendous. A lot of families without good access would have to go to internet hotspots, so you could see people congregating in parking lots or something. Not quite the way to have kids learn. Okay, I've talked about all children and some different demographic groups. Michelle will talk about the impact on children with disabilities. Michelle.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Stites. I'm an associate professor at UMBC. I am in the education department. My research area focuses on early childhood education for children with and without special needs. I do have a special place in my heart for mathematics learning. But as with all things COVID, much of that shifted to the impact of COVID on children with and without disabilities, because that was the need in the field. And so, as Susan mentioned, we found during COVID, in both research that Susan and I did together, as well as the research of others, that COVID had a really negative impact on children's learning. We know that academic and social emotional growth were lost for all children during that initial fully virtual time, a lot of which I can tell you was spent, we pivoted very quickly at the collegiate level to virtual learning. Susan gave the example of how during spring break, we were given 2 days to prep and we kind of took off running. It was a little bit slower for much of the school systems. We had the luxury, if you will, at the college level of assuming all of our students had devices. At the PK-12 level and the preschool level, they couldn't make those assumptions. So that pivot for them was a little bit slower. I know working with our pre-service teachers, we had a district who didn't roll out virtual learning until April of 2020, and that was just for high school. The elementary schools didn't receive any access to virtual learning until May, early May, mid-May, when they were ready to begin that. So it's no surprise. And again, our research, the research of others, really verifies that opportunities for that academic and social emotional growth were lost. So we said to ourselves, and we grabbed Julie because she is a practitioner as well as a researcher. And we said, all right, so we know this. We know that kids are being negatively, are still being negatively impacted by that transition to virtual and hybrid learning. But what did that look like for kids with special needs? So we said to ourselves, all right, what do we know in general about kids with special needs? Well, we know it's pretty widely accepted both across the research and by practitioners in general. And I can tell you, I was in the classroom for over 10 years, that kids with special needs oftentimes need more support with their academics. So reading, literacy, social studies, science, all of the good stuff we learn in school, but also their social emotional needs. Kids with disabilities really, by and large, benefit from their quote unquote typically developing peers. The typically developing peers are able to serve as academic models, language models, social models. They're able to show what age expectations are for those different areas that they are working on in school. Well, as you can imagine, when that transitions to a child sitting in his or her bedroom or his or her kitchen, those models are no longer there. So we said to ourselves, okay, we're starting to kind of understand what the impact was on kids without disabilities. What if we kind of hone that down and talk about kids with disabilities? So we were able to survey 153 parents of children who were identified as having a disability and received some sort of special education services in their school. Next slide, please. So what did we find out from these parents? Well, the parents, by and large, reported that during that time, during both virtual learning when the kids were completely in their houses and hybrid learning looked a little bit different everywhere. But I think generally speaking, the model of hybrid learning tended to be you went to school maybe every other day, or you went to school every other week, and the other days you were virtual at home. So during hybrid learning, we had teachers balancing half a class in the classroom in the schoolhouse and half a class at home on Zoom or on Google Classroom. And so as a result, the parents were saying, okay, we understand, this was a challenge. And I want to preface this by saying teachers did what they could. I think that's a really important thing to mention. Teachers, by and large, and I am a teacher at heart, Julie is still in the schoolhouse. Susan has been a teacher. I think by and large, it's really important to keep in mind that these teachers were really asked to build the plane while they were flying it. This was not something, and I can tell you, I've been in teacher ed now for a few years. This is not something we had ever prepared our teachers to do. So the teachers really, by and large, were doing what they could. with limited resources, limited training, and really limited support, just because nobody knew what kind of support to give. You don't know what questions to ask. So as a result, parents said, about 60% of our parents said our kids' special education support hours have decreased. And the hours that have decreased were not just that special education component where the special educator takes the time to go in and work with the student or pull the student out, depending on what model they were using. They were also significant decreases in related service hours. So when I say related service hours, I mean things like speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, things that are critical for children with disabilities to kind of get that comprehensive educational component that they need. One really interesting thing that we found was the younger the children were, the more likely they were to receive services. So we know that overall, parents said about 60% of our parents said less special ed, less related services. Interestingly, though, when we broke it out by elementary school, middle school, and high school, if a child was to receive his or her special education services, it's more likely that they were in elementary school. So 43% of kids in elementary school still received their special education services. Not great. But when you compare it with middle school, where only 25% of the kids received their special education and related services, that's a big difference. And then when you go to high school, only 20% of those kids received their special education and related services. So as you can imagine, without those necessary supports, academic and social progress for these kids was lost at an even higher rate. So we have kids who have IEPs to support their academic and social progress. And we don't just, in the school system, we don't just give IEPs to everybody, right? So these are kids who were already struggling in some area of their educational progress, whether it be academics, whether it be social. Oftentimes it's a combination of the two. And so these kids who were already quote unquote behind were falling even further behind. So we've got kids who are behind pre-COVID. We have sort of education as a whole during COVID where everyone's falling behind. And now these kids who were behind to begin with are even further behind. So especially concerning. Next slide, please, Julie. So what else did our parents tell us about? Well, they said this was kind of a struggle across the board. No matter how you looked at virtual learning for kids with disabilities, parents were saying it just didn't work. In fact, that's the title of our article is "It Just Doesn't Work." And that is a direct quote from a parent. It just doesn't work. Parents did say overall that live whole group general education instruction was probably the most effective, but that was only 26% of parents said it was even kind of a little bit effective. Parents also felt about 20% of our parents said that when they received their special education services, and keep in mind from the previous slide, they weren't really receiving them at the same rate that they had been prior to COVID. About 20% of our parents said, okay, when our child could get on, one-on-one with the special educator, that was maybe a little bit more effective. They also said that when they had small groups, 23% of our parents said when they could meet with a small group with the general education teacher, maybe a little bit more effective, and 31% said special education small groups were maybe a little bit more effective. But what you might notice is we're talking here about percentages in the 20s and maybe 30s, low 30s. So these are very low percentages of what parents are saying was effective. Our parents also noted that what they really needed from the schools was to be flexible, but only 24% of our parents indicated that the schools were flexible. And again, I want to really preface this because I did this at the college level, and this is not easy. Teaching virtually, managing things hybridly is really, really, really hard. But the parents did say that when they got, 24% of the parents said when they got some flexibility, with things like due dates and even how their child was able to participate. That made it more effective for them. And so when they talked about due dates, sometimes it was extending things. When they talked about participation, we had a number of parents report that even attending to that whole group live instruction was really difficult. They had a really hard time understanding, their children had a really hard time understanding what they were expected to be doing during that whole or even small group instruction. That attention to sitting there in front of the computer the way many of us are doing even right now was difficult. You know, I want you to sort of put yourself in the position, how many Zoom meetings have we all attended over the past, 3 years? I am a terrible Zoom meeting attendee at times, right? I am, if I go to a faculty meeting on Zoom, I am not always attending to what is being asked of me. So imagine you are a 7-year-old with a learning disability where the material is confusing and you're being expected to attend. I hopefully know what's, going on in a faculty meeting, but I'm not always attending, right? So that was a challenge. Parents also reported that their children struggled with understanding what was being taught. And I think, we're working with a population of children here who need extra supports when they're in person to understand that instruction. And then there was the ever-present need for appropriate socialization. In March of 2020, April 2020, none of us really knew how to socialize virtually. That was something that was never a part of our daily lives, right? We texted each other, sure, but hopping on Zooms and learning how to socialize, that's just not a natural thing for us to do, or at least it wasn't then. I think we've gotten better at it. So it's understandable that these children who already may have had difficulty socializing didn't know how to socialize on Zoom. Next slide, please. So what did our parents say they needed? The number one thing parents said that their children needed in order to make this even the tiniest bit effective was basically an adult sitting next to them 100% of the time. It was a constant need for an adult next to them. Susan talked about the example of the parents who hired a tutor because they were working full time. So you can imagine having a child who needs constant adult support while you are trying to do your job, which is now also on Zoom, unless you were a first responder. You're on Zoom, your child's on Zoom, your child needs you sitting next to them full time. You're trying to do your job. Many parents have other children who needed adult support. It was really struggling. So 40% of parents actually said their children needed constant adult support. Other parents noted that the lessons and the activities that teachers were sending home just took too much time. So what we would have done normally in the classroom, we're pivoting now to online, except we didn't have the luxury of being with the kids 6 hours a day, 6-7 hours a day. So now parents are getting activities that, number one, they don't necessarily know how to implement with their children because they're reporting that adequate directions were not provided, but also that these things just take too much time. So I can tell you anecdotally, as a parent, I was on Zoom, my husband was on Zoom. I had 2 children who were also attending Zoom school. And there were times when I was like, I don't know what this is. And I'm a college professor in teacher ed. And I would say, I don't know what they want you to do here, because we were, I think, as teachers providing directions that we would have provided in the classroom that didn't necessarily translate. It was almost like speaking a different language, because now we're trying to translate them for a completely different situation. So I thought a really telling quote that one of our parents gave to us in this survey was, "It's up to the parent to modify, teach, and let's be honest, do the work." So as you can imagine, if the parent is doing the work, the children are not gaining anything from that assignment. Next slide, please, Julie. All right, so our parents also noted some really, I think, important things to consider. So we know we have the significant number of parents who are saying, this just doesn't work for us because of this constant need to be assisting and providing support for their children. And one of the biggest reasons that they weren't able to do this was because they were trying to work. And I think a lot of us as professionals, as work people, members of the workforce, were very concerned during this time that we were going to lose our job, because there are jobs that don't necessarily translate well to Zoom. Susan talked about the concerns that preschool teachers faced. I think that was a definite concern for a lot of working parents. We know that there was a great layoff during COVID because businesses were shutting down and they were not able to pay their workers. So we have parents who are bending over backwards to complete the work when they were asked to do this virtually, but at the same time, they need to sit next to their child. And when the child had a disability, parents said this was an incredible stressor for them during that time. Parents also reported to us that, yes, they're trying to work. They're trying to sit, next to their child while working and support them with their learning. And we know that kids with disabilities have more learning needs than kids without disabilities, but they're also trying to handle the virtual learning or even just the day-to-day care of other children in the family. I can't even imagine what it would be like working with a child with a disability while trying to do my job while caring for an infant or a toddler or another child with a disability. In some cases, we had parents report they were working, they had one child with autism on their right and another child with autism on their left, and they're trying to support across the board. And this really, I think, just even increased the general stressors that people in society had caused by COVID-19. I talked a lot about the insecurities people had with their employment, but people also were very concerned about what happened if they got sick. What happened if an elderly parent got sick? What happened if they weren't able to care for their children? We had, a relatively large number of single parents who responded to this, and they were the only person there for their children. So they were facing that kind of stress. And so parents have all of these things in, kind of encompassing what was going on while also trying to make sure their children who normally would have been in school with additional support got at least a little bit of education. So there were a lot of stressors going on. And it wasn't just the parents who were stressed. Teachers also had and continue to have a lot of things to say about what this meant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle. And as mentioned, my name is Julie Grossman, and I'm excited to be here with you all today. I am a practicing school psychologist in Prince George's County Public Schools, so a local school district in Maryland. And as mentioned, I also do adjunct teaching at UMBC, and then I also do research on the side. So it's been interesting to see this from all different perspectives. But today, what I'm here to share with you is teachers' perspectives on the challenges that they experienced while teaching students with educational disabilities virtually. I'm then going to go on and share not only those challenges, but how the teachers managed to do this. What strategies did they use to teach students with disabilities virtually? And then in closing my presentation, I'm going to be discussing the difficulties, the learning gaps that teachers have been seeing with students with disabilities now that they've returned to in-person learning. And moreover, how are these teachers addressing such gaps? So before going into all of that, I want to have a few things to preface with. First, as I present to you, I just want to remind you something that's already been said, and I'm sure something that you all know, but the pandemic has been different for everyone. So while I interviewed teachers all from the same district, all actually teaching in elementary school, not one of them reported having the same experience when it came to teaching students with disabilities virtually. And then similarly, we have to recognize that the schooling experience was equally different and individualized for all students, specifically students with disabilities. So some students were successful and some were less so. For example, I've heard from many families, especially those who had children or have children with emotional disabilities, that the virtual learning was actually more successful for those children. And they also attributed or often attributed that reason to be that the triggers for these students often weren't as present in virtual learning. Similarly, I have heard from many families about the negative impacts that their students experience during virtual learning, both in the academic and the social and emotional domains. So one of the teachers I interviewed stated exactly this when she said, "We should be careful not to make generalizations about students in regards to whether the impact was good or bad. It depended on the student, the disability, the teacher and their teaching style and level of devotion, the school and their level of care for students. So did they send manipulatives or books or more?" The fact that students had such different experiences can be attributed to many factors, some of which were more related to individual differences, whereas others related to the amount of supplies and support that schools were able to provide back in March 2020 and April 2020 when this all began. So for example, that same teacher said to me, "During virtual instruction, I made bags of manipulatives for my students to use with me during my instruction. Students were sent or it was left at the building for pickup, math manipulatives such as counters and place value blocks. I also sent whiteboards, markers and erasers, crayons, pencils, extra erasers, pencil sharpeners, as well as phonics books and workbooks. The school prepared math manipulative bags as well. This helped my students minimize learning loss. I understand this was not the case in many schools around the country or even within the same county. School was taking place virtually as if we were in person. The schedule was followed and instruction was happening daily in my school." So when speaking to one of the teachers, she did an excellent job of really providing me a quote that really touched upon all of the challenges that she faced and summarized all of the challenges that she faced during virtual teaching. And as you can see in her quote, she references, and I've highlighted those in red, many challenges, including those with having difficulty related to technology, having students who didn't have the components, the devices they needed, and therefore weren't in attendance even. Students having the necessary support at home, so they had someone to go ask questions to in person. Students, actually responding during instruction. Students completing and turning in their work. And then there were also challenges related to various environmental factors and honestly, a lot of distractors. So as we go on, I want to unpack these challenges a bit more. And as I do so, I'm also going to talk about how teachers that face these challenges, I want to bring your attention to the differences in their different situations, most notably the different SES, socioeconomic status, and geographic locations of their schools. Because while talking to various teachers, I noted that several brought up the same type of challenges, but yet they had different experiences, often attributed to these factors. For example, every teacher I spoke with noted the big learning curve that had to do with technology. But the specifics about their difficulties varied. So many teachers discussed the difficulty with learning how to use all the new technology and how to teach students how to use all the technology. For example, one teacher said it was a challenge to have students log on, use online features such as mute and camera, logging into digital tools. The challenges were greater with younger students than older students. Older students learned quicker. However, the challenge of typing remained. And while some noted that these challenges did get better, Others actually noted continuing to have difficulties related to teaching students how to use the technology at the expense of teaching them content. So, for example, a teacher from a lower socioeconomic status school that's comprised predominantly of English language learners, many of whom identify as Latinx, she said to me, a lot of time was spent on teaching technology. Very often, we'd spend the entire session directing students where to click instead of teaching content. In third grade math, students are asked to solve multiplication, which requires an array. So we'd spend time focusing on how to insert the table, how to make it larger, how to add rows and columns, but not actually how to do the problem. And then we have other teachers, especially those working in the lower socioeconomic status areas, especially those in inner city schools. And when they talked about issues with technology, they talked about it more in regards to access to technology rather than how to navigate the computers or iPads. So, for example, one such teacher reported, the digital divide was huge. Students not having the support at home to help them to access getting online. Having to get a hotspot or not having access at all was horrible. I had to meet them in the school parking lot. Or parents had to drive students to a friend's house before work to get internet. Many teachers also noted how difficult it was to sustain children's focus without having physical proximity as they're accustomed to, or the use of incentives to help motivate the students. Those in more affluent areas noted that their students often wanted to show off their home environments. So, for example, one teacher said in regards to being asked about the challenges with attention, she said, the biggest challenge was all of the distractions of home. Students were bouncing on their couches, jumping on beds, watching TV, doing their hair, eating, constantly disappearing and saying, I'll be right back, babysitting younger siblings, playing with toys, bringing their Chromebooks around their house to show off their new toys, and more. And then those in lower SES areas, socioeconomic status, said they more often noted the difficulty of the environment around the students and how those things really interfered with them learning. So one such teacher said, some students were home alone. Others had difficulty finding quiet places for them to access the education. I had some students where each child of the family was in a different corner of the apartment. And even when they all wore headphones, everyone could hear what was going on in all other classes. One of the students had to take care of his little baby brother and couldn't focus on me. Another family didn't have electricity, and so the little girl had to go on the balcony to try to use the sunlight to help her see the screen. And all of this only pertained to students who were actually in attendance. I had many teachers of students with disabilities who shared that attendance was a problem beyond having their technology work. Many students would sign off or not attend the subjects that they perceived or found to be more difficult for them and more challenging for them. The last main challenge expressed by teachers I spoke with pertained to both the nature and the type of special education service being delivered. So, for example, one teacher noted that the focus of special education sessions was different. Specifically, she said, pre-COVID, we would work on specific skills with students during pull-out sessions. We would focus on and address students' identified deficits. However, during COVID, students with disabilities understood less of the classroom instruction than before, which meant our pull-out sessions now focused on reteaching what was being taught in the classroom and helping students complete their graded work. And then the types of supports that teachers were able to use also, of course, changed during virtual learning. So another teacher touched upon this when they said, We could no longer use physical proximity to support students. We could not use hand-over-hand support. We could not interrupt the classroom teacher during a whole group to speak to a student who was distracted. So we've identified those challenges, the key ones, and believe me, there were many more, but those were the overarching ones. And so now I want to talk a bit about the strategies teachers used in response to these challenges when teaching students with disabilities virtually. And as you can see from the quotes on the screen, many of the teachers I spoke with attempted to incorporate visuals and utilize different interactive platforms such as Nearpod and Jamboard and Google and Pear Deck and more. Teachers also tailored some strategies for students with specific disabilities. So with students identified as having an other health impairment due to ADHD, teachers would utilize competitions and provide more breaks. And then with students who had identified developmental delays, they were found to be helpful when more visuals were used. Other teachers found it was really helpful to utilize virtual manipulatives and virtual whiteboards. And then the final component of my segment has to do with, now that students have returned to in-person learning, what gaps are they seeing exist with students with disabilities, and how are they addressing such gaps? Across the board, teachers commented about having to reteach the basic fundamental skills across subjects, math, reading, and writing. So one teacher said, there has definitely been a fallback on the basic skills. I had to reteach certain basic skills that I knew they could do pre-COVID, but lost the consistency of the skill, such as decoding certain word patterns, add, subtract with regrouping. I just had to keep on moving with reteaching those skills. All teachers I spoke with said that there have been significant gaps in writing, especially with students with disabilities, since returning to in-person learning. And let's be real, writing was not used in the same way for sure during virtual learning. And that's why many of the teachers believe they've really had to go back and reteach these foundational skills. So for one example, one teacher said, students' writing skills have been challenging because they don't know how to write since they were asked to type all their answers during virtual learning, which means they were using keyboards. Also, a lot of activities during virtual learning did not even require writing, but rather drag and drop type movements. So now that we are back in person, these students do not know how to form letters correctly using pencil and paper. I had to start all over again when they came back. I needed to teach them to write correctly. And when I say write, I mean letter formation and spacing, for example. Many teachers I've spoken to also have noted an increased difficulty with behaviors since students have returned to in-person learning. And this has been significant across the board for all students, but especially significant for those students with disabilities. So for example, I spoke with a second grade teacher who teaches inside of an autism classroom. And she said, these students come back to school and now school is not what they knew it to be. So speaking of two of the students I teach who have autism spectrum disorder, I frequently observe these students playing by themselves, and it isn't parallel play. It's more like because they are used to playing alone. And then she continued by saying, it has also taken my students a while to get used to the rules and routines of the structured environment of school. For example, virtually, I didn't have to tell you to go to the bathroom because at home, mom says when you have to go, you go. But now you have to get my permission. So as I conclude this presentation, I do want to remind you where I started. Virtual learning was not all good or all bad. Some students with disabilities flourished during it, while many unfortunately did not. And so one thing I want to leave you with is that regardless of the experience or the challenges or the strategies used pertaining to how teachers taught virtually when it came to students with disabilities, our educational system has been truly forever impacted, specifically in the methods now being used to teach. So, for example, one teacher said, and I will close with this, many classroom teachers and I continue to use these digital tools for our in-person teaching today. In combination with in-person teaching, they work with all disabilities and all grade levels. They maintain students' attention and are motivating. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I will turn it back to you, Susan.
We have just a few minutes left. So what I will do is very quickly summarize here. Clearly, COVID affected everybody. COVID affected all children in the educational system, particularly children with disabilities. The issue now, and although there's certain benefits that we've gotten, that Zoom instruction will remain forever in some sense, but we're left with the problem of how do we bring these kids back up to speed? Will we just assume that everybody's lost out 2 years and that'll be it? What can we do? Do we focus on skills? One teacher is doing that, focusing on handwriting. But there are only so many minutes in a day. So while you have a 3rd or 4th grade child focusing on handwriting, is that child missing content knowledge? Are we sort of dooming the kids to stay behind permanently? And I don't think we yet have a good understanding of how to handle this. In olden days, we used retention at times, but that was always problematic. So that isn't an easy solution. Other issues to think about are how are we going to handle the differential impact of COVID on subjects? The impact was greater on math and science, on different groups of kids, low-income kids, kids with disability. How do we vary the instruction based on the age, etc.? This isn't the first time kids have lost school. I grew up in New York City when teachers were on strike for 3 months. They handled it by making us stay, I think it was an hour more a day, and that worked out. In Montgomery County, when my own children were younger, there was a massive snowstorm that I believe closed the schools for 2 or 3 weeks. And again, they, I think, made each subject a bit longer. But we've never had a situation as long or as massive as COVID. And we really haven't figured out how we can bring the kids up to speed. One thing we cannot rely on, however, is assuming we have many, many, many teachers waiting in the wings to help. We don't. There have been massive, could you switch slides, please? There have been massive teacher loss. This past summer, we had something like 36,000 vacant teaching positions. We don't have enough people to populate each classroom where a teacher is needed. We can't just assume there's a large pool of teachers waiting in the wings. Teacher ed programs have decreased in size and have decreased now more than ever. And again, where the need is highest is where the fewest people who seemingly want to teach. What do we do when 30 kids arrive in a classroom and there's no teacher? Who do we put in there? We used to have all sorts of requirements, although they differed by state. We required that a teacher be certified by a university or college, that they get a certain score on an exam that was nationwide. Some states are saying That'd be nice, but we can't do it. So Arizona recently said a bachelor's degree is no longer required to be a teacher. And if you think about it, will the teacher know as much, more than the person he or she is attempting to teach? That's the logical consequences of what's occurring. I'm going to stop. I know we took more time. I thank you for listening. Are there questions?
Yes. So is there any question that you guys wanted to ask?
Well, thank you so very much then. I thought we do. We have our emails on the last slide here. And if anyone wants to contact any or all of us, please feel free to do so. We do handle stuff virtually. We read email and we will get back to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So we have one question.
Oh, you do have a question. Okay, great. I'm not able to hear the question.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay.
But I can't hear the question.
Yeah.
It's test. Yeah, I see a signal here. So I don't know why it's not working when it gets to right there. Does this work? No, that's just a.
So maybe if you want to come here and try. Sorry for any comment.
Question, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for your presentations, but I was concerned by the look from within the academic silo, thinking that learning does not occur outside. I would be curious about the question learned outside school and how can the society.
We've lost you again.
I guess, yeah, I will tell them to email it then.
We heard most of it. Do you think, sir, you could repeat it just so we could hear it? We'd love to have the question. Fifth time's the charm.
Maybe if you hold it. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. I was learned outside.
We've lost you again.
No.
Why don't we respond to what we think your question is?
Okay.
You're basically sort of saying the academic silo is not the only place that well, I think this is what you're saying, is not the only place that children learn. And I absolutely agree with you. We correctly or incorrectly took the view that we wanted to focus on schooling in the more formal sense. That was what the paper we'd written seemed to address. And I think the reality is both play a role. I don't think there's that much information, if any, on what kids are learning outside, what kids learned outside of the formal school context during COVID?
I went ahead in the chat and I linked to Susan and I put together 2 conversation articles. One is about preschool during COVID. One was about working with preschoolers with special needs. And both of those articles include suggestions for out of school learning. I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, but things that both parents and teachers can do to support children and that families can do to support children, kind of outside of the schoolhouse.
Let me also mention another study that Michelle and I did. This, we had just discovered online surveys, I think it was, and we sent out a survey nationwide to parents of preschoolers. The respondents were mainly educated middle-income mothers. And among other questions we asked was, how confident do you feel assisting your child with reading and math? Do you want to learn more from the teacher, etc.? And one of the things I thought was interesting was that these parents, who I think were somewhat diverse in race and ethnicity, but still the majority were white, a large percentage of these educated parents of preschoolers did not feel confident knowing what to do to assist their kids, that they just didn't know, and particularly in math, that they were highly dependent upon learning from the teacher. And the reality is they said the teachers weren't providing them enough stuff to do at home. So while the world outside of school, I think, is very, very important, often parents need stuff from schools to help them maximize what goes on outside of school. I should also mention that several years ago, I had an article in The Conversation about what parents of preschoolers can do to help their children learn math. I had something like 400,000 people looking at this. People in Japan, it was actually the cover story in Japan Newsweek. People all over the world looked at this article. Nobody has ever read anything of mine to that extent. The only thing I can conclude is a lot of parents of young kids don't have knowledge about what to do with their kids. And if this is the case when they're that young, I think they would be even more dependent as the kids get older. So I hope we've sort of answered your question.
And I know time is out, but if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to email us and we will certainly answer it.
Sure. Thank you
you.
so much, everyone, for this wonderful, what do we call, meeting. So now we're going to turn off this thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.